my glamorous tech assistant. Oh, great, I can see it's recording, excellent. Yeah. So, the zine is now available. It's online at thebookishtype.co.uk. You can now purchase it. Of course, you can also purchase it in store once we're finally allowed to reopen, once it's a bit safer to do so, hopefully next month. But yeah, available as of now online. And those of you that wish to purchase it within by next Tuesday, you'll also receive a free badge in the post with your zine, and I'll just give you a little brief look, these cute little badges. You'll recognize this from It's a Sin. We'll have ample opportunity to talk about that soon, I'm sure. Very excited to do that. So yes, thank you once again for joining. And as you can see, I'm not alone. I'm joined by Gill Crawshaw and James Ward. Thank you both so much for joining. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly? I've got lots that I would love to say about you both, but I'll let you talk first.
Hi, I'm Gill. I will keep it brief. I'm here as I am one of the founder members of ACT UP Leeds.
And hi, I'm James. Lived in Leeds all my life, came out when I was 16, which was just before Clause 28 was proposed and debated. So I came out into a climate that was in the middle of the period, if you watched It's a Sin, kind of right in the middle of that 10-year period that drama covers, and when we were under quite significant attacks. But it was a very exciting time actually to come out, and I think it prompted a lot of, in many ways, a lot of benefits and advances that perhaps we wouldn't have had we not had those attacks on us and got us out onto the streets.
Yeah, brilliant, James. Thanks so much. Yeah, so as Gill said, she is a founding member of ACT UP Leeds. For people that don't know, ACT UP Leeds is an international grassroots political group that works to end the AIDS pandemic, and as well as the inequalities and injustices that perpetuate it. It was founded in New York in 1987, and then soon other ACT UPs sprung up around the globe. ACT UP prefers direct action or non-violent civil disobedience to encourage those with power to make the changes necessary. And Gill will be talking a bit about the actions that she was involved with in Leeds when they were active in the 80s and 90s in Leeds. So at the time, as James mentioned, there was a lot of discrimination going on, a lot of prejudice, a lot of ignorance around HIV and a lot of homophobia. And ACT UP formed as a response to the lack of governmental action and the things that were just frankly being allowed to happen to a lot of people. And to give you some idea about the kinds of actions that ACT UP did, the first one was a demonstration on Wall Street in New York. This came at a time when AZT, which was the first drug that became available for people with HIV and AIDS, came to market with a company called Burroughs Wellcome. But Burroughs Wellcome immediately raised the price to $10,000 a year, making it the most expensive drug ever. So ACT UP immediately responded to that and used direct action to get Burroughs Wellcome to lower the price. And they were, after a few years, successful in doing that. It did take a long time and a lot of labor on their part. So that's the kind of things that ACT UP did. And Gill's going to be talking more about what the demonstrations looked like in Leeds and what the focus in Leeds was. James has told you a bit about himself. He's also done a lot of work with Yorkshire MESMAC, which is a sexual health organisation. It's one of the oldest and largest sexual health organisations in the country. And James will also be talking about MESMAC and the other services that are available for people living with HIV in Leeds today, as well as he said, talking about his own experiences of the 80s and 90s, really, the crisis years of the HIV epidemic, and reflecting on where we are or where we aren't today when it comes to stigma surrounding HIV, and as well as effective HIV prevention and medication as well. So before I come to you, Gill, I would just like to talk a bit about the zine itself and the kind of the current moment into which the zine is appearing. We've already mentioned It's a Sin. That was one of the things that really caused Nicola and I to have lots of conversations about the AIDS epidemic from the 80s and 90s, and kind of how it was being remembered today and portrayed today, and the kind of the ways in which it was continuing to impact different generations of people. So there is another guest here, if you like. She's backstage, you can't see her, but Nicola Hargrave is one of the two people who runs the Bookish Type, and she's put a lot of work into this scene, so I'm very grateful to her, and she is listening, so thank you, Nicola. So why did we decide to write the zine? Well, apart from the fact that lots of people are talking about HIV at the moment because of things like It's a Sin, I'd actually, a few months ago, because of my work at the Bookish Type and being exposed to, you know, loads of amazing works by LGBTIQA+ authors from past and present in the shop every day, I'd go in and I'd see all these amazing works, all that history right there. And HIV and AIDS had been something that I'd been interested in for a long time, because I felt that I wanted to know what had happened, and, you know, I was aware that something had happened, but people weren't really talking about it. And I was aware that it kind of was relevant to me, but it was, you know, one of those things kind of surrounded in enigma, kind of like the word gay, that I wanted to learn more about, and I felt like it was relevant to me, but I couldn't really ask anyone about it and didn't know where to go for information. And so I'd started to read books, read memoirs on the epidemic, and I'm really, really grateful to Nicola and Ray for recommending books and for allowing me to go away and read them and then come back into the store and, you know, kind of process it with them. I found that really helpful. It was a big education for me, and so It's a Sin kind of came at a time in which I was already kind of going through this process of digesting what had happened and thinking about the inheritance that I have from that time, you know, the good things and the bad things. It was never mentioned in school as I was growing up, unbelievably, and I've had a conversation with James about this, and we always joke that it's like I grew up in the 80s, and it really is. Like, there was just nothing in school. I had very basic sex education, but it was kind of very much confined to the realm of science and reproduction, and it was all about kind of brave, manly seamen swimmers going and finding the passive egg, and kind of, it was all about, this is how you make a baby, and that's the point of sex. Nothing on safer sex, and nothing about the epidemic, which had happened, you know, just a decade before, because this is the early 2000s when I'm in high school. So, you know, in the kind of classroom, wasn't hearing anything, and when I was at home, it was never a conversation that came up either. But of course, outside of the classroom, that was where I started to kind of inherit the kind of shame, really, and bits of misinformation from the epidemic. It was very much still thought of as a gay disease as I was growing up, even though it was actually in 1999 that heterosexual contact became the cause of more new infections than people having gay sex. So, you know, we've known for a very long time that this isn't something that only affects gay men, but that was not something that that I was learning when I was growing up. And, you know, it is perhaps still sometimes seen as a gay disease. And a brief look at figures has shown me that in 2019, 46% of new infections was actually due to heterosexual contact. But these are the kinds of things that we don't really hear about, and there's still this kind of weight, I think, which is why it's so great to have conversations like this, and I'm really thankful that we can do something like this today. Yeah, so one of the things in the zine is me as a personal essay that I've written reflecting on everything that I've just been talking about, what I feel like I've inherited from that time. You know, I've been speaking a bit about the kind of the more negative side of that, but then there's also this massive wealth of history of, you know, really powerful and empowering activism and activist work, loads of fantastic stories. And that's been really inspiring for me. And so I kind of talk about that as well. But of course, this isn't to deny that HIV did not devastate gay communities. It absolutely did. And It's a Sin depicts a bit of what that is like, what that was like in the UK. Nicola and I found it very powerful and, you know, wanted to respond. Nicola herself was wanted to promote the amazing work that a lot of women, and particularly lesbians, did during the epidemic. It was a time when the communities, gay and lesbian communities, really came together, and a lot of amazing work by a lot of amazing women. So Nicola's done some great research, and the zine is packed with stories of these women and the work that they've done. And Vito Russo, the well-known film historian, said, you know, remember the lesbians and what they did for us. And it's absolutely true. And I still actually find myself thinking that today in Leeds and the kind of circles that I mix in. I'm always thinking, you know, there's loads of lesbians doing really great work, and I'm really, really thankful, you know, just the different projects that I get involved in. Yeah. As well as the essay, I've also done some book reviews. Shout out to lesbians, yep, absolutely. I've also done some book reviews. I've picked 3 of the kind of most inspiring texts that have kind of helped me in this education that I've been on, this journey. One written by Derek Jarman, kind of writing in '92 in the midst of the storm, really. He's will shortly die from AIDS-related diseases after writing that text. Sarah Schulman, another amazing lesbian, she has got a kind of intellectual memoir reflecting on that time, which I've reviewed, as well as a contemporary novel that's set in Brazil, kind of thinking about HIV in today's world of PrEP and U equals U, and, you know, completely different thing to what it was like in the 80s. And James will be able to talk to us a bit about that later. So all of this coming together has, it was really nice. Nicola and I were having these conversations, and it was really nice to kind of have this opportunity to channel all that energy into something like the zine. Another thing that is in the zine is an interview that Gill's recorded for the West Yorkshire Quiz Stories project. The West Yorkshire Quiz Stories project, for those that don't know, is an oral history and archiving project that ran for 2 years, from February 2018 to May 2020. It's a really, really great resource. You can hear Gill, the full interview with Gill, talking about her time with ACT UP, as well as a group interview with some of the members. And there are lots of personal stories about living with HIV as well in West Yorkshire. So I would love to come to you now, Gill. I've spoken a bit about the misinformation and stigma surrounding HIV and the devastation that it caused. But, you know, from your perspective, could you talk about what things were like then, and the history of your involvement with ACT UP?
I will, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that introduction, and you've actually, you know, introduced ACT UP and what that was as well. And just before we go on, just bear with me while I share screen. Okay, I'm going to presume that works. Somebody will tell me if it's not working. Yeah, so this is a picture of a couple of ACT UP Leeds members with our second banner, having lost the first one. Anyway, so yeah, thanks Joe. You said that, you know, ACT UP was started in New York and it spread, it was an idea that spread around the world. ACT UP stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which sort of is a very American sounding name. But yeah, it was a coalition. It was bringing together individuals who were united in anger, to use one of the ACT UP slogans. And again, you know, you've already said what were things like here, and you've said, you know, that there was this sort of terrible climate of ignorance and fear and hatred around HIV and AIDS. And this is, as I say, we're talking about the late 80s and early 90s. And it sort of, and it permeated everything really. And I think people were shunned if there was any hint or anybody suspected that they might be HIV positive. And if you were gay, then that was, you know, you were very often suspected for being HIV positive. So that affected individuals. It also affected organisations as well. Leeds Gay Switchboard, for example, they used to use a room in the Students' Union at the university. And so, you know, they'd have to pick up the keys and give back the keys at the end of the night. But the porters there refused to handle the keys. They refused to touch a key that a gay man had touched. I mean, that was how bad it was, how ridiculous it was, but how terrible it was. And of course, as we said, you know, people were dying, the treatments and the research just weren't happening fast enough. So, you know, in Leeds, we know people who were ill, knew people who died. We have to remember that third sector services have begun to be established as well. So in Leeds, as well as MESMAC, which we've mentioned, there was Leeds AIDS Advice, which was really important, really vital for the support that they gave. But as well as those sort of third sector organisations, there was a lot of anger and there was a sense of urgency because the government just wasn't moving quickly enough in funding that support and effective treatments just weren't being developed. And so people with AIDS, people who are HIV positive faced terrible stigma and discrimination. So that while those third sector organisations who stepped in were absolutely vital, there was a need for something else. Some people thought there was a need for something else. There was a need for something that was more direct. And again, Joe, you talked a bit about direct action. That's what ACT UP was all about. It was about taking direct action. So this broadly means it's being confrontational. It's acting outside sort of the established channels. And it's about using the means available to you to make your point, to get your voice heard, and to challenge authority. So I guess that's the unleashing power bit, you know, and very often what we would do is use our bodies and our voices, you know, to stand up to authority. And ACT UP, though, was non-violent, but we did often use civil disobedience, so that meant that we sometimes risked arrest. Not that we wanted to get arrested, but, you know, sometimes that did happen. And that focus actually on direct action is what attracted me and many other people to ACT UP, because we wanted to bring about change and we had a belief that that sort of direct action works, it's effective. When you look back at other political or liberation movements, then often direct action's been like quite decisive or a tipping point, or it's got lots of people on board, or it's brought an issue to, you know, widespread attention. So yeah, that's why we thought direct action was really important. And we've mentioned ACT UP New York. ACT UP in the States was certainly really good at bringing the issue to widespread attention. And I don't know where it was that I first saw a film of ACT UP New York. It would have just been a short clip somewhere, but you could see how powerful it was and how effective it was. And it wasn't really like anything else. I mean, we're here tonight launching a zine, so I'll just mention sort of creativity and art. yeah, creativity and really, really sharp design was a key part of ACT UP from the beginning. It was part of what grabbed attention, and it was something that got the press interested as well. And, you know, like many other people, I was impressed with the really, really great graphics of ACT UP. So this photo, you know, obviously is ACT UP New York, and you can see the common, you know, you might well be familiar with the slogan, silence equals death. It's on the back of the zine as well, of course, that inverted pink triangle on a black background. And then the ACT UP logo was a similar clean, bold typeface, and it drew people in. So it's really good in the zine to see the women that were behind the design celebrated. So back to Leeds, here's a group of us, I think maybe looking very different. This is after an action though, so we're a bit relaxed. We started ACT UP in Leeds in 1990, and we had a public meeting in the Civic Hall just to see, you know, who would be interested in it. I can't remember who were, you know, a few of us said, we want to do this, let's get it together. And we've advertised that in Leeds of the paper, which many of you will know was a weekly alternative radical paper. We got a speaker from ACT UP Edinburgh, which I think ACT UP Edinburgh were actually the first to start in the UK, not London. But soon after, there was ACT UP in Leeds, and there was groups in Manchester, Norwich, and yes, there was a group in London. So after we'd had that meeting, there was enough interest to set up a group in Leeds. There was probably about a dozen people, I'm guessing, at the core of it. And then we'd meet really, really regularly, at least fortnightly, often weekly, to plan actions. And yeah, we did loads of actions, and I haven't time today to talk about them all. But our first action I'll talk about, which was against the Youth Hostels Association. And you wouldn't necessarily think they were an organisation who were going to be the bad guys, but they had a policy of refusing to allow people with HIV and AIDS to stay in the hostels. They just had this total ban. So, sorry, this picture's small. These are all old photos, of course. So the Youth Hostels Association, YHA, they had a camping supply shop on Briggate. So this was our target for the action. A small group of us went in, we got some sleeping bags down off the racks, and we zipped ourselves into them. Other people were inside the shop and outside on Briggate, leafleting, letting people know what we were doing, why we were there. Yeah, I can remember being very nervous about doing this beforehand. But as you see, once we got started, it ended up being a bit comical. Yeah, the police did come, the police were called, sometimes the police were called. They couldn't easily grab us because we were in these slippy sleeping bags. Yeah, we were like slippery worms or something. Anyway, yeah, so we weren't arrested, but the YHA issued an injunction against ACT UP Leeds and ACT UP in London as well, which banned us from demonstrating anywhere near any of their venues, that's their shops or their offices. So that was like, you know, this is our first action, actually amazing. You know, obviously we've hit a nerve here. The YHA also claimed damages to their property. There wasn't any damage done, but also to the reputation. So it's like, what? Anyway, more importantly, though, just a few weeks later, the YHA lifted the restrictions on people with HIV and AIDS. So that was great. What a great start we're off to there. It was a victory. And I think, you know, those actions and that, what they saw as damage to their reputation had really helped in the decision that they made. I'm just going to say, none of us joined ACT UP for a laugh, but actually we often did have a bit of a laugh when we were there. We did have fun amongst the actions, and we built a real sense of community. Now, our group in Leeds, we had 0 funds, and yet I've talked about ACT UP in New York and how impressed we were with their design, and we didn't have access to anything like that. We didn't know anybody who could design stuff for us, so our aesthetic was definitely DIY, punky. But we wouldn't just turn up at actions with placards. We'd maybe make props to make us stand out a bit, or we might dress up a bit. So here we are outside the dental hospital with some giant teeth. And I think, you know, we'd sort of taken on board that lesson of aiming to capture the press's interest. And the reason why we did that was we weren't just aiming our actions at whoever the target was, but we also wanted to challenge the misinformation that there was around HIV and AIDS. That was a really important part of what we were doing. Again, sorry, a bit of a small photo, but here we are outside a Texaco garage because we were urging for a boycott of Texaco, who'd introduced compulsory HIV testing and refusing people jobs if they wouldn't take a test or if they were HIV positive. I don't have much time, as I say, to share many of the stories of our actions, but a lot of them in Leeds and in the UK, we spoke to the other ACT UP groups in the UK a lot. A lot of our actions were around discrimination, misinformation, as I've said, and sort of organisations' practices that suggested that only certain people, usually Africans, gay men, people who use drugs, that these were the only people who were affected by HIV, and therefore they were the only ones who needed to pay any attention, take precautions. But that sort of information also implied that these groups were to blame for this deadly disease. So yeah, you know, as well as the dental hospital, we targeted the blood transfusion service, insurance brokers, large corporations, Benetton, prisons, and of course the government. So this is a photo of a march down the Hedgerow on World AIDS Day, a bit of a crowd with banners here. Now, I'm going to say our actions, as I said, usually we had quite a specific target and we'd have a demand for change. So, yeah, quite early on, however, we started organising a demo for World AIDS Day, some sort of action for World AIDS Day. And this again was reflecting our sense of urgency and frustration and the way that the day was generally marked with a candlelit vigil. I mean, there was an ACT UP slogan, "Red ribbons are not enough," which maybe summed up our feelings about World AIDS Day. So on World AIDS, and I'm not saying that some of those things weren't important, but you know, we felt there was a need for something more than that. So in 1992 on World AIDS Day, we organised the march in the city centre and we got quite a big crowd. It was a Thursday early evening, so town was busy with people doing Christmas shopping, and we marched down the Hedgerow, and then when we got to Dortmund Square, we stopped and we held a die-in. So everyone lies on the ground and just stays there, which soon at that time, traffic went up and down the Hedgerow, not just buses, so there was traffic jams, yeah, and of course a bit of blockage. So the police came quite quickly. At that time, there was the police station at Millgarth near the market, so the police were just at the other end of the road, really. Again, I said we weren't planning really for people to be arrested. So, and we thought, you know, staying in the road, we wouldn't have achieved anything further by prolonging that. So once the police arrived, we said, come on, everybody, get up. Yeah, that's it, success. And we congregated on Dortmund Square. And then one of our members, Mick, he stood on the plinth of the statue of the man with the beer barrel. Those from Leeds all know that. Just to thank people for coming and say, well done, you know, maybe if you want, we'll go for a drink later, something like that. And that would have been the end of the story and we would have all gone off. However, the police were obviously looking for ringleaders and they thought they'd found one. So they arrested him. And then, you know, there was a bit of kerfuffle and then they arrested Deke as well and took them off down the road to Millgarth Police Station. Now, once they got to Millgarth, the police wouldn't process Mick and Deke before they put on rubber gloves and masks. And I know obviously we're very used to masks and rubber gloves now, but it just showed a complete misunderstanding of how HIV is transmitted. So in turn, I mean, they did let them off and there was no charges made, but in turn, that activity by the police led to another demo a couple of weeks later. Just here's a poster for it. It was the rubber glove demo, a rubber glove extravaganza, as it says here. I mean, this was an amazing action. Loads of people came, people from around the country. And you can maybe get a bit of a sense of that in this photograph. So we brought loads of huge surplus thick rubber gloves. I mean, you can see there's Jude and Mick there in the photo, and you can see they've got these huge rubber gloves like gauntlets. Some of them were black, some of them were green, and some people brought their own marigolds again. You can maybe see that in the photo. Somebody behind, I think, got yellow rubber gloves on. And we marched through town on a Saturday afternoon, wearing these gloves with placards that said, "Keep your gloves off our bodies." And we all descended on Millgarth Police Station, just to shame them up, really. I mean, that's what we did. It was covered in the paper, and it was a really good demo. And then later that night, we had a rubber-themed party, which went down in legend as well. And this is another just gathering for World AIDS Day outside the art gallery. I'm just going to quickly finish with some key points about why ACT UP was effective, whether it's ACT UP Leeds or, you know, ACT UP in general, really. I think we were dedicated. Individuals were dedicated to a greater or lesser extent, but as a group, we were quite dogged, and we would have campaigns and we would keep on organisations. We were well informed. I mean, we read all sorts of things, you know, bulletins, medical stuff, all sorts of things. And we were in regular contact with mainstream AIDS organisations. So whether that was Leeds AIDS Advice or MESMAC, and national organisations as well. And being well informed meant that we could make demands. We were well organised. I'm going to say we were well organised, mostly. When you get the zine and look in it, you'll see there's a story which I'd tell where actually we could have been a bit better at reconnaissance, but that was the exception rather than the rule. And being part of a network really helped. We were networked with other ACT UP groups. We used to get together regularly, but also we're part of the local community as well. And we were bold, we were imaginative, and we did things that would get noticed. Okay, and that's it from me. Just one last photo, an early photo of us after an action. Thanks, everybody.
Amazing, Gill. Thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to see all those photos. Really brilliant. Thank you. I can't believe that the police were still wearing rubber gloves to handle you in 1992. That's over a decade into the epidemic. Is really telling. Yeah. So thank you so much, James. Gill's kind of told us a bit about ACT UP and you know, her experience of that time in the 80s and 90s. I'd really love to hear from you now. You know, what was going on for you during that time? I think you were, how old would you have been at the start?
I came out in 1987 when I was 16, and I say that was right when Clause 20, I came out in October, and I think it was at the end of that month that Clause 28 was slipped into a bill that I think had already passed the first two stages of Parliament. It was a local government bill that, you know, was covering all sorts of uncontroversial stuff in comparison, and then they slipped in this clause banning the intentional promotion of homosexuality and the representation of gay families as pretended family relationships. And you know, I guess if you kind of, what I was struck by when I was watching It's a Sin and thinking back to that time was actually just go another few years before HIV, into 1967, when gay sex was partially decriminalized. And it was a very kind of it was done begrudgingly and reluctantly, with the clear warning not to flaunt ourselves or expect, you know, any kind of equal treatment. We really should stay hidden. I think people recognize the law shouldn't intrude in private bedrooms, but that was as far. And you know, the sponsors of the bill said, you know, if you flaunt this, you will make the sponsors of this bill regret their actions. And in fact, what happened after that partial decriminalisation was that prosecutions of gay men trebled, because instead of being prosecuted under the old law, they were just prosecuted for gross indecency instead. And of course, gay men had nowhere to meet, except really, you know, public toilets and parks and very covert meetings. And so they were the very places where people were then arrested. And as I say, the prosecutions trebled after 1967, and it still had the same detrimental impact on people's lives, on their jobs and their families and every aspect of their lives, as well as a criminal record for gross indecency, a sexual offence. So that was 1967. So if you think through the 70s, as I was growing up, as I was a child born in 1971, just the fledgling start of some kind of gay pride and starting to operate outside of the shadows, and to try and have, you know, gay pride marches starting in the 70s and gay liberation front starting in the 70s, and then bang, the 80s arrive and it's HIV, and that was held up absolutely as being God's punishment on the unholy. That was what I was taught at school, was that God had designed men to fit inside women and not inside men, and that AIDS was God's punishment. And that was the end of my sex education around HIV and AIDS. And, you know, the press took enormous delight in gay men dying and suffering very horrible deaths. And it really did sort of prove the point that, well, we should never have decriminalised this in the first place. So into that era, that was the Thatcher government. Thatcher very famously did a speech at the Tory party conference where she was saying that kids were being taught they haven't, I can't say this word ever, inalienable, you know what I mean, inalienable right to be gay. And that was the purpose of Clause 28. So it was just, as I say, just the kind of the heartbreak. You use a phrase, a really beautiful phrase, Joe, in your essay about, you know, something dark that happened to gay men. And it was just such a long period of dark, horrible things happening to gay men. But I came out right before Clause 28. And so my memories, and, you know, my mum, my dad and my sister are all, I think, here watching this. And, you know, we've always campaigned, they've always campaigned, anti-nuclear, labour movement, women's movement, Greenham Common, socialist politics at university. So campaigning was just the place to be. So I very comfortably just took straight to the streets. I remember the age consent at this time was 21. So here was a 16-year-old. Just, I think, I had no time for this bullshit. I was not prepared to take this lying down. And it felt like a lot of people at that time just said enough. You know, I think there are moments in queer history, like you go back to 1966 and the Compton cafeteria riot, which was, you know, trans people just saying, fuck it, enough. We're not going to take this police persecution anymore. The Stonewall riots, you know, more riots, which history has been rewritten as if it was cis white gay men who led those riots, but it wasn't. It was black trans women leading those riots. And so there've been these moments in history where we've said enough. And I think Clause 28 was actually a really big moment for us, because it's the largest demonstration that I've ever seen going through Leeds. You know, Briggate, at that time, it wasn't pedestrianised as it is now, but we filled the street from side to side, from top to bottom, going around the corner to the Corn Exchange, going round the other corner at the top onto the Hedgerow. It was massive. It was a massive demo. And to have that much visibility, I think, despite the harm that law did to us, I actually think the response to it did us more good in the end, because that visibility was what I think started to break down the, you know, the demonization of gay men that was able to persist whilst we were hidden and invisible. Couldn't really happen like that anymore. And, you know, to kind of make the parallels with today, it's like you could take any of those headlines in the newspapers from the 1980s. Swap the word gay for trans, and you've got headlines from today. And it's the same thing. I think the demonization of trans people, this idea that trans women are a threat to cisgendered women, you know, it comes from the fact that, you know, people are allowed to tell these lies about us, which is why I think as cis people, we should be taking up the cause of trans people absolutely with gusto, because we need to create the same visibility around trans liberation as we did around gay men. And gay men particularly, let's not forget, it was trans women, lots of black trans women who led the cause for the liberation we've achieved. You know, we need to show up now, I think, for trans people.
Absolutely, James, you make some really, really important points there. And thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. Really learned a lot listening to both of you, so thank you very much. And I do have some questions. I mean, I've got so many questions, but I think firstly, to kind of start a bit of a discussion, really, I'd love to know more of your thoughts on It's a Sin, because it's such a great way to kind of get talking about this thing, about this whole topic, really. Russell T Davies has said that he's not going to make another series because the first series kind of said everything that he wanted to say. And there definitely are a lot of messages in that series. And, you know, from your points of view, what do you think he was trying to say? And, you know, are there other things left to be said? I mean, James, you've already spoken about how history does become rewritten, and, you know, voices do become marginalized, and not always the great work of certain groups in society is not always remembered. You know, one of the reasons why Nicola has done a lot of work to make sure that we remember the women and lesbians in the zine that we're bringing out today. So, you know, what was he trying to say, and is there anything left to say?
Is that to me or Gill?
Both of you.
Yeah, both of us. Who's going to go?
Fight it out.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you know, he said that he wanted to focus on men, on gay men in this series, and I really liked it. I really liked It's a Sin. And of course, there could be more things that could be said, but I guess that will be another programme, you know, or it will be a longer programme or whatever. I mean, I know, you know, you were sort of asking about what we thought about it, though, and what, I don't know, you know, what he might have been saying. I mean, if I had to pick up on anything, then it would have been how women were depicted in the programme. Either, you know, you've got Saint Gill on the one hand, but then I particularly didn't like, having said I like the series a lot, I didn't like that last episode where everything was, you know, put onto the one character of Richie's mother, that, you know, everything was terrible, was just voiced by her. And I would have liked that to have been, you know, just spread out a bit more, really. Not that, you know, it wasn't that those things weren't being said and thought and expressed by family members, by whoever, but it just seemed, you know, to focus that all on one character was just too much. I mean, the other thing as well, I think it would have been better, I would say this, to name, you know, the protest group, the group who was organising that, to say that was ACT UP who was doing those demos. You know, it was just this sort of, I can't remember what they called, you know, nameless group who were doing that. But, you know, it was a short series, it was limited, so maybe it was difficult to get a sense of whether that was Gill and her good works, you know, of being part of something bigger and part of a movement of people resisting that. Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, that's enough from me on that one.
Yeah, I'd like to know what within the 5 episodes that weren't commissioned. You know, he I forget how many TV companies he pitched it to who turned him down, and Channel 4 picked up but only wanted 5 of the 8 episodes. And so, of course, there were huge chunks missing. You know, there wasn't enough examination of race and racism in that series. It was very much, I think, centered on the experience of predominantly white gay men. And so, of course, as a white gay man, that resonated hugely with me. And there were so many occasions in that show. I mean, I felt like I was processing it and really grieving for a good couple of weeks after I binged on it, because I think, similar to what Russell T Davies said, it kind of took this much distance to actually be able to really examine that trauma. It was such an enormous trauma, and as you've written so eloquently, Joe, a trauma that actually still echoes today, even to people your age. But there were so many moments. I mean, and that last episode, I really liked it. I hadn't thought of it from that point of view, Gill, about how, yeah, they did demonize Richie's mum, make her the vessel of everything bad. But I found the kind of intensity of it, and particularly the speech that Gill makes to Richie's mum on the beach side, where she talks about shame, was so powerful, because shame, I think, for so many people living with HIV is such an overwhelming and prevalent experience, and certainly something I really struggled with for 20 years until I finally started treatment and became undetectable. And the process of becoming undetectable and actually starting to feel very full of energy, because I hadn't realized how much HIV had been just sapping my energy, and then really starting to process, probably for the first time properly since my diagnosis. And there was a book I read called The Velvet Rage, which is his premise is that gay men growing up in a kind of cis patriarchal society learn to feel shame early on. And there was just one line in his intro, though, because it was a republish of an earlier copy, and he said, I think since then he'd become HIV positive, and he had this line about, if the shame of being gay is bad enough, the shame of being HIV positive is so much more so. And it was reading the line in that book that I realized, oh my God, I've just been ashamed. I've just been ashamed for 20 years, because I could never understand, like, I never actually engaged with ACT UP. I've looked at all those pictures and recognized so many faces in those pictures, Gill, and it's like, where was I? Where was I during that time? And I think actually it took me so many years to be able to kind of process that shame and to engage with the topic of HIV and to feel comfortable being out about my diagnosis and my status, and to try and do something useful and positive with that. And I think that's a really common experience. So there's a wonderful speech that Gill makes in that final episode that covers shame so beautifully. And of course, Richie's mum is a representation of so much more than mum. But Gill says a line about, all those men are dying because of you. And I just found it such a powerful thing, the shame that society had put upon us, and then loaded more upon us for getting this disease, was very, very accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to say, James, yeah, I'm sure you did come on a demo.
I did. I came on the one to Armley Jail. I remember we flung condoms over the wall at Armley Jail until the very scary guards told us to go away.
It was quite early on, but for people who don't know, I'm just going to say, because you've done so much great stuff since. I mean, you speak so well, and in all sorts of forums, in public forums on telly, about your diagnosis, about your experience, and just you've done so much to raise awareness and to challenge wrong thinking, I would say. So yeah, it's good to know you.
Absolutely. And the thing that I was really thinking as you were speaking, James, was clearly the importance of seeing these kinds of experiences represented, someone writing about it in the Velvet Rage, seeing it on screen in It's a Sin, that really helping you to kind of process it and think about that time. But we don't have depictions. It's very rare. It was a struggle for Russell T Davies to get television to show It's a Sin, and it had to be an edited, cut down version. And you've spoken about shame from a very personal perspective, but it really is something that is kind of fostered because of the society that we live in. And one thing that sprung to my mind as you were thinking is, that there's no real sense of the fact that what was lost in that during that time was a loss. It's, you know, there's still no national memorial in this country for people that died from AIDS, even though 20,000 people in this country died. There's still no kind of collective sense of these people were important, they were valued, and their loss is felt as a loss, and there are consequences for us today that we need to think about. And, you know, just doing some reading in preparation for today, I saw that 2 days ago on Sunday in New York City, which is a city that we've been talking about a lot because it was, you know, profoundly affected by HIV and AIDS. They were kind of marking their first COVID death 2 days ago, a year on. And they had the mayor of New York speaking, the first lady was speaking. They projected images of the people that had died onto the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, this is all happening 2 days ago. But it took 7 years to get World AIDS Day. It took New York until 2016, almost 4 decades after the first AIDS cases, for them to have a memorial. And in the speech at this memorial service 2 days ago, the mayor said, you know, we've lost to COVID, we've lost 30,000 people. It's a number we can barely imagine. That's more New Yorkers than World War II, Vietnam, Hurricane Sandy, 9/11 put together. You know, he's listing the terrible things that have happened to New York City. No mention of AIDS, nothing, still. This was 2 days ago. So there really is no kind of collective sense of, you know, we've lost some people that were valued, and, you know, people living with HIV now are, you know, it's not their fault, it's important, they're important, etc. So
I was talking to somebody the other day who was speaking to her boyfriend's parents, who are, you know, in their they'll be in their 60s, talking about COVID, and apparently they in their minds this is the first pandemic they've lived through. And she said, hold on, there's been another one in your lifetime, but it wasn't, because as far as they were concerned, it didn't touch them. You know, they're straight, they're cis, they don't take drugs, they're white. So for them, this is the first pandemic. It's like, no, there was another really, really big one.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there must be, for anybody who did note it, who, you know, wasn't directly affected but did note it for whatever reason, a real sense of relief that it seems to be over, because there's more effective treatments now. So yeah, we can forget about it now because it's all over. Everything's fine. I do think, you know, that maybe people think that there's a cure, which there isn't a cure as such. But I think people think that, you know, no, it's no big deal. It's like having diabetes, and lots of people have got diabetes. But yes, I'm sure there's, you know, a sense of relief that, yeah, we can forget about it, and then we think that COVID is the first pandemic.
Yeah, really important points, and thank you so much, both of you. We've only got a few minutes left, so even though I've got so many questions, I will open it up to the audience now. I'm just trying to have a bit of a browse through the questions, so if people have any questions, please do send them in.
I want to just say, you know, HIV could be over globally. It could easily be completely over. We have the drugs. If everyone who has HIV was on treatment, there would be no more transmission. And until that point, everyone who's at risk could be offered PrEP. So certainly in a rich country like this, we could have this done today, but globally we could have this done with this. So that, you know, is just political decisions that still, I think, are based on not valuing certain lives as much as others.
For sure.
Absolutely. And that's, I mean, one of the reasons why ACT UP is still going strong today, particularly in London, reformed in 2014. One of their campaigns was to what's called Stand Up for PrEP, because it's been such a struggle to get PrEP onto the NHS. You know, a drug that can, you know, prevent the transmission of the virus and prevent people becoming infected with HIV, as James has said. So we've got one question, which is for you, Gill. Could you speak about the differences between the Leeds chapter and other ACT UP chapters? Did different ACT UP groups focus on different things? Were they organised in different ways?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were very different because we saw what ACT UP New York was doing and thought, yeah, we want to bring that to the UK, but we knew it would be different just in terms of a number of things. I mean, in terms of health services, actually, you know, because we have the NHS here, and I'm not saying that that was perfect in the early days by any means, but, you know, we do have that. So I think we didn't have as much of a focus on treatment as some of the other groups did, particularly in the States. I mean, and I also have to say, you know, those groups in the States, and particularly ACT UP New York, we went, yeah, a friend and I visited New York in the early 90s, and we went to an ACT UP meeting, one of their weekly meetings. There were hundreds of people there. And, you know, we'd be getting half a dozen people to meetings, and some of our actions were very small. So the numbers involved were very different. And I think, as I said, you know, we were much more focused around issues of discrimination and stigma and that misinformation, trying to challenge that. Yeah, so we were, you know, a lot of our targets were organisations who just, yeah, needed to understand HIV and AIDS and needed to act appropriately and needed to not basically discriminate against people. And while we might not have had such a focus on treatments, then it was recognising that, you know, discrimination is really bad for your health anyway. But yeah, I guess that was the difference. And I think you mentioned ACT UP Paris, who again, ACT UP Paris was a much larger group. And again, you know, they had different focuses. But in terms of the UK, I think we were all pretty similar and had a really good network and relationships and often ran campaigns on the same issues. But we came into contact a lot. There was World AIDS conferences, and we used to go to the World AIDS conference. We used to get so many places for activists, for ACT UP groups. And so some of us were able to attend those World AIDS conferences where we were really able to, you know, meet directly with the other ACT UP groups from around the world. But yeah, we did do things very differently and had different focuses.
We've got, if people are willing to hang around for a few more minutes, I will just ask one more question. We've got a lot of questions coming through for ACT UP. People definitely seem to be very interested in that, Gill. And we've got some people asking if there were collaborations with Black or African groups at the time or migrant groups.
No, I'm going to say no, there wasn't. And now, you know, I mean, I think there was a gap at the time, and certainly, you know, if we were doing actions now, it would be very different. And I think we'd also be more mindful of global issues as well. But yeah, no, that was, yeah, we didn't do that at the time, particularly now.
And that's something that James has also touched on. And I brought up ACT UP London a few moments ago, and ACT UP has had a global focus for a very long time. And as James said, this is a global pandemic that is going on, and it's perpetuated due to political decisions. I definitely, from my sense, it seems like having that more global focus is what's really important to activist groups working at the moment. Yeah. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed myself and learned a lot. Seems weird to say that I've enjoyed myself, considering it can be quite a heavy topic, but it's really important, and I really appreciate what you've both done. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe. Your zine is brilliant. Everyone buy the zine. It's really good. I've learned a whole ton of stuff, and your essay is beautifully written.
And if people want to make sorry, I know it's your last word. You know, if people want to make contact, via the Bookish Type, I guess is the easiest way. Then certainly, you know, yeah, we can do that if people want to talk more. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good point, Jill. If people do have any questions or want to follow this up in any way, feel free to contact the Bookish Type. And as I've said, the zine is now available, and it will be delivered with a free badge if you buy it within a week, by next Tuesday. And just going on the back of what Jill's just said, we do have a large resource list at the back as well, based on the things that Nicola and I have been reading and what's available out there. Some brilliant memoirs, fiction, non-fiction. Yeah, so a really useful resource.
It is.
Thank you, Jill. And also check out the West Yorkshire Quiz Stories project as well, because that's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone. Kit, I'll ask if you can end it.